All right. Welcome, everyone. Good to see people streaming in. I'm going to give it a minute for everyone to arrive, and then we'll get started. I'm really excited. Okay. Good evening and welcome. Welcome to JWA's Book Talks. I am Betsy More. I am Director of Programs at the Jewish Women's Archive, and I'm standing in tonight for Judith Rosenbaum, our CEO, who couldn't make it due to being at the Jewish Women's Forum at the White House. So I think we will all agree that she has a good excuse to miss tonight. But I am thrilled to be with you all tonight for this kickoff to our March Book Talk series. We invite you to say hello in the chat, introduce yourself, and make sure that you're chatting to everyone and not just to host and panelists, which is the default. We are, and also please add your questions to our conversation as we chat. We always love and value and depend on audience participation. We're delighted to be able to continue gathering together from all around the world for meaningful conversation and learning. A few words about JWA for those who may be new to us. We are a digital archive that expands and transforms the way we understand history and Jewish culture by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We believe that uncovering a more diverse and nuanced story helps us create a better world. The book talks are one aspect of JWA's work, and I hope you will check out jwa.org to explore the full range of projects and resources that we offer. It is my great pleasure tonight to introduce our two guests. Nell McShane Wulfhart, who is graciously joining us from Uruguay, is the author of The Great Stewardess Rebellion, How Women Launched a Workplace Revolution at 30,000 Feet. Nell, for 15 years before writing The Great Stewardess Rebellion, was a travel writer, freelancing for various publications and with a column in the New York Times travel section. Originally from Philadelphia, she's lived in Ireland, Vietnam, Korea, Israel, and other countries, and is now based in Uruguay. I am also delighted and honored to introduce Sonia Pressman Fuentes. Sonia was born in Berlin, Germany, and came to the US with her family in 1934 to escape the Holocaust. She has been involved in the women's rights movement since 1963, when she testified in Congress in favor of the passage of the Equal Pay Bill on behalf of the ACLU. In 1965, she joined the General Counsel's Office of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, popularly known as the EEOC, as its first woman attorney. As we will hear, she contributed to several landmark papers there and decisions. She drafted one of the EEOC's earliest digests of legal interpretations, its first guidelines on pregnancy and childbirth, and as we will hear more about, its decision finding that airlines violated the law when they terminated or grounded stewardesses upon marriage or reaching the age of 32 or 35. She is a co-founder of the National Organization for Women, among many other prominent feminist organizations. If I listed all her honors and accomplishments, we would not have the time to actually discuss the book tonight. But I will finally add that she is the author of a wonderful memoir, Eat First, You Don't Know What They'll Give You, The Adventures of an Immigrant Family and Their Feminist Daughter. Thank you both for being here tonight. It is an honor to speak with you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having me.
Nell, I wonder if you could start by telling us a little bit about how you came to write this book.
Sure. As you said, I was a freelance travel writer for many years. And if you know any freelance journalists, you know that they are always looking for book ideas so they can stop doing 20 things at once and just do one thing for a short bit of time. And I had the best gig in travel journalism at the time. I had a column in the New York Times travel section where I interviewed celebrities about what they took in their carry-on luggage when they traveled. This was like my dream gig. It was super fun and very easy. One of the people I interviewed had made a TV show, and one episode, he told me, was about this kind of secret revolution that had happened among stewardesses in the 1960s and how they had been living in this incredibly sexist workplace and how they had sort of turned it all around through like their own actions, through the feminist movement and the labor movement. And on the phone, I said to him, that sounds like it would make a great book. And then I sort of scurried off and wrote it.
Well, that's a wonderful story. How did you start writing it? What strategies did you use to go from having heard this tidbit to creating this wonderfully researched book?
Well, people always talk about how well researched it is, and I really appreciate that. But I also think it's really a story about people. And there are two main characters in the book, two stewardesses who started working, one in the 60s, one in the 70s, and also Sonia. She's like my third heroine of the book. And it was just extensive interviews, getting to talk with so many women who had worked as stewardesses in the 60s and 70s. I didn't know this before I started writing it, but once you start talking to women of a certain generation in America, it turns out like they were all stewardesses. They just started coming out of the woodwork. There are so many of them. So getting the stories was not the hard part. Choosing the stories to go in the book was a little more difficult.
Can you tell us a little bit about the two stewardesses that you focused on the most and how you came to find them and select them?
Of course. Pat Gibbs, she's sort of one of my main characters. She was on the television show that the guy I interviewed had told me about. She had appeared there for a few minutes, and she had started as a stewardess at American Airlines in 1961. And she only retired maybe like 10 or 20 years ago. Like she was a stewardess for a very long time. And she transformed over those years from somebody who was just excited to be a stewardess, and her main goal in life was to be a stewardess supervisor, into this like militant feminist and labor organizer who basically staged this incredible rebellion in the stewardess union in the 70s. And her counterpart was a woman called Tommy, who is from Texas, started working in 1970, also at American Airlines, someone who was very passionate about social justice and a strong feminist, and how she too, when she stepped into this incredibly sexist world of the airlines, was also moved to like take big formative action and make real changes. And the book talks about how the changes that these women fought for actually impacted all American working women today.
Can you walk us through a little bit what it was like to become and then be a stewardess in 1962?
When I thought about that era, like the golden age of travel in the 1960s, I always pictured Don Draper from Mad Men sitting in first class, a very like slim, conventionally attractive white woman, very young, slicing filet mignon for him, serving him a cocktail, that sort of thing. And it turns out that is actually true. That was a really accurate representation of what it was like to fly in the early 1960s. And then the more I dug into the story, the more I found out that the women who were serving Don Draper, those young stewardesses, they were burdened by all these rules. Not only were there things like they couldn't have scars on their hand or pimples on their face or crooked teeth or wear glasses, they also couldn't weigh. They had about a certain amount. They were kept to like a very, very strict weight limit that was based on their height. And if they gained even a couple of pounds, they could be pulled off a flight or even fired. And then I learned that besides all those things, it turns out that if they wanted to get married, they would be fired from the job. If they got pregnant, they would be fired from the job. And if they somehow managed to avoid both of those things when they turned 32, or in some cases 35, they would also be fired. So the outside view and what it was like from the inside were two very different things.
Were the women who joined as stewardesses surprised to learn this when they entered, in American Airlines case, the stewardesses college, or if that's what it was called? I'm trying to remember the exact name.
It was called the American Airlines Stewardess College, which is where they were
College.
sent for 6 weeks for training. Each airline had its own stewardess college, and the American Airlines one was known as the Charm Farm, which I thought was amazing. They knew something of what it was like. They had the idea, but the airlines managed to portray this as such a glamorous job. Like it was really aspirational to be a stewardess. You really could see yourself serving men like Don Draper, wearing designer uniforms, jet setting all over the country, maybe the world. Like all the ads that recruited them portrayed this. There was one ad from 1961 that was recruiting stewardesses, and it said, it was a picture of a woman smiling, and it said like, "This morning sightseeing in New York, and in about 5 hours, I'll meet my date for dinner in San Francisco." So it was like, a job where it was really aspirational. And of course, when they start training and they realize there are these restrictions, some of them, they don't even notice, because even at the interview to become a stewardess, you were weighed, you were measured. The person interviewing you, often a man, would ask you to walk across the room to the other side, walk back again. Patricia Ireland, who was the president of the National Organization for Women for 10 years, she was a stewardess for Pan Am. And she told me when she had that interview, and the interviewer told her to like turn around, walk over there, and inspected her body, she didn't think about it twice. It just seemed perfectly normal to her.
I was really struck by that in your opening chapter, when you're talking, we're kind of, the reader is meeting Pat, and we kind of go with her from her childhood through her interview and her training and her determination to be just kind of note perfect as a stewardess for what they're expecting. And like, even as she found it really challenging, but her determination to stick with it. And this is someone who will ultimately become extremely militant in the union. She didn't bat an eye. She, at least if I'm telling this correctly, and please correct me if not, she just was determined to make sure that she hit all her notes.
She wanted to toe the line. She wanted to succeed as a stewardess. She was a real rule follower. And all that she wanted was to be a success at American Airlines. And if it weren't for the fact that the conditions for those women were so harsh, with the weighing and the uniforms and these incredible restrictions, she would have been an incredible success. She would have been a stewardess supervisor, maybe a manager. Maybe 30 years later, she would have been in corporate. But it was the fact that these workplace conditions were so bad that actually turned her into this, militant fighter for workers' rights. So it's really the airlines did it to themselves, we could say.
And what were the first steps towards fighting these incredibly sexist regulations?
There were a lot of them. There was individual action. There was action through the union, protesting grievances around small things like that. There were a number of court cases that the women at the airlines would start taking the airlines to court. And then there was the Civil Rights Act, which came in 1964, which included Title VII, which aimed to prevent discrimination in employment, including sex discrimination. And that was when, the stewardesses, I would say, were the first women to really see the potential of Title VII to fight sex discrimination. Because from the perspective of the lawmakers and pretty much everybody else, this was something that was put in place to fight race discrimination in employment. But the stewardesses, they had been protesting the fact that they were getting fired at the age of 32, that they couldn't get married, that they couldn't get pregnant. They were protesting all these things and getting nowhere. And then when Title VII came into law, they thought like, oh, we can do something with this. And they became constant petitioners of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. I think in the first 18 months that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission was opened, they were the agency that were in charge of promoting Title VII. I think 25% of total complaints came not just from women, but from specifically stewardesses. Wow. Like they really took this and ran with it.
That's really impressive, given the number of incredibly sexist industries women were working in.
Yeah.
Which is essentially all of them, but clerical workers, waitresses, sales, there's just this range of industries where women were fighting these regulations and sexist treatment, not to mention traditionally male industries like medicine, law, et cetera. So it's really interesting that stewardesses were among the first to see this as a wedge that they could use to enter to claim equality.
Exactly.
Sonia, I wonder if you would tell us a little bit about how Title VII came to be enacted in the law and how the EEOC first responded to sex discrimination complaints under Title VII?
Of course. As has been said, the act was in response to the movement for civil rights for Blacks in this country. It was not anyone's intention. Well, I'll take that back. There were two people who were interested in adding sex discrimination. But beyond that, the act was passed, was proposed in response to the movement for rights for Blacks. There was no similar movement before the passage of the act for women's rights. So about 2 days before the bill was about to be voted on, a segregationist congressman from Virginia, Howard Smith, proposed that the bill also include a prohibition against gender discrimination. This was totally unexpected. And there have been different people surmising what his motives may have been. And we know what some of his motives may have been, but we really don't know exactly why he proposed that, because he was opposed to the bill and voted against it when it came up. But anyway, he introduced an amendment to include a prohibition against gender discrimination. At that time, Congresswoman Martha Griffiths told me later that if he hadn't proposed it, she would have proposed it. She was a feminist, and she would have proposed it for the right reasons, that the act should also have included gender discrimination. But anyway, he proposed it. Nobody there really wanted it as part of the bill, but nobody also was going to raise their hand and say they were opposed to including a prohibition against gender discrimination. So because of that, the bill was passed with a prohibition against gender discrimination in it.
And once the bill got passed and the EEOC was established, how did the EEOC respond to complaints from women about sex discrimination?
Well, by and large, with some exceptions, at that time, the EEOC had 100 employees at its headquarters building. And just about all of them had come there to fight racial discrimination in this country. They didn't want, there were two things: a legitimate reason for not enforcing the sex discrimination prohibitions, and what I would call an illegitimate reason. The illegitimate reason is that they had come there to fight racial discrimination, to use the statute to fight racial discrimination. They did not want the resources of the EOC to be diverted to this new thing, gender discrimination, with some exceptions. So by and large, they didn't enforce that part of the law. What I call the legitimate reason for their not enforcing it was that the prohibition against gender discrimination raised a number of legal issues that no one knew how to decide, because there had been no movement before this came into the law. The prohibitions against discrimination based on race did not raise such difficult questions. But among the questions raised by the prohibition against sex discrimination were things like, well, a big issue was state protective legislation. This country had in the past passed legislation to help women on the job. They did it because although they wanted to pass such legislation for men and women, they didn't think this country would pass such legislation. So they thought half a loaf was better than none, and they passed legislation to protect women. For example, women couldn't work certain hours at night. They had to have rest periods. They had to have benches. They couldn't work in certain occupations. So then the question was, how can we allow such laws to continue when we now have an overriding federal statute that says you can't discriminate on the basis of sex? So that was a big issue, how to deal with state protective legislation. Other issues were, I remember one woman wrote in her husband was a policeman. She didn't want him riding with a woman, policewoman, sitting next to him 8 hours a day, and wrote in to complain about that. More serious problems were, did an employer have to hire a pregnant woman when she applied for a job?
Mhm.
Could he fire an employee when she became pregnant?
Which, as we know, was standard operating procedure in several professions, not only stewardesses, teachers, kind of foremost among.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But now Title VII raised the question whether they could continue to do that. So we had a number of those kinds of issues to decide. No one knew how to decide them. No one wanted to accept, as I said, there were exceptions at the commission of people who did want to enforce the entire act, but except for them, nobody wanted to get into these issues. And so for about 1.25 years, the commission was not enforcing that part of the law.
And what started to move the needle? What pushed the commission to need to start acting on these complaints?
Well, I think a biggie was the fact that after the first fiscal year, when we got statistics, the statistics showed that 37% of the complaints filed with the EEOC alleged sex discrimination.
Mhm.
Everybody was stunned by that. And I think that was a big factor in their turning around and beginning to say, we have to enforce this part of the law. I like to think that I also played a role in that, because I didn't come to the EEOC with any preconceptions. Before I came to the EEOC, I'm ashamed to say that I had never thought about sex discrimination in this country. I was an immigrant, a refugee to this country. And when I came here, my family and I used to travel to Miami Beach for the summers. I'm sorry, for the winters. And I was immediately struck by the racist headlines in the newspapers, the racist signs on benches and water fountains, and everything was segregated. I was a child, I saw that, and I knew it was wrong. And I became someone with a lifelong interest in ending racial discrimination. But I never saw the treatment of women as something that should be changed. I can't believe how blind I was. I just accepted the way women were treated as that's the way things were done. So I did not come to the EEOC with any agenda. But once I got there, I read the law. Wasn't a complicated law to read. And it very clearly said that employers, labor unions, and employment agencies could not discriminate on the basis of sex. Couldn't have been clearer. There was a small exception. We later decided it was small. There was an exception called BFOQ, which stood for bona fide occupational qualification. For certain jobs, and I can talk about that later on, for certain jobs, you could discriminate on the basis of sex, but we ended up finding that there are hardly any of those. So I read that law. It was very easy to understand. So I was aghast when I saw that, with few exceptions, nobody at the EEOC was interested in enforcing that part of the law. So every time we discussed something, I would speak up and say, what about women's rights? To the point where my boss, the general counsel, took to calling me a sex maniac, because I would mention that every time anything came up.
I loved that part of the book where Nell described you being referred to as a sex maniac. Just one example of how people get pigeonholed when they start speaking up about something uncomfortable in workplaces. I was very interested that Eileen Hernandez was also at the EEOC at this time.
Absolutely.
Please go on.
Well, Eileen Hernandez was an African-American woman who had been married to a Hispanic man. I think she was divorced when she came to the EEOC. She was a Black woman, but was also interested in the prohibitions against gender discrimination in Title VII. And she was a feminist, as I became there. And she was someone who was strongly interested in having the commission enforce the prohibitions against gender discrimination. There were other commissioners who felt as she did. Another one was Sam Jackson, who was a Black commissioner. He, I think, was interested in it because he wanted to help Black women, but he was also supportive. And then there was a wonderful man named Dick Graham. He had previously been with the Peace Corps. I think he might have been head of the Peace Corps at one time. I don't recall. A very fine man. And he was interested in enforcing the prohibitions against gender discrimination. But there were also men in power at the EEOC who were strongly opposed to doing anything with regard to women's rights. Those included Luther Holcomb, the vice chairman of the commission. It included Dick Berg, the deputy general counsel. It included Herman Adelsberg, the executive director. So you had top men at the EEOC who were strongly opposed to doing anything about women's rights.
Yeah, I remember one quote from one of the men in the book. I'm blanking on the name, who said that he would defend his right and any man's right to have a female secretary.
That was Herman Adelsberg.
Yes, yes, and to have someone with that attitude be in charge of enforcing an anti-sex discrimination statute is quite poignant.
It was very difficult, very difficult.
I can only begin to imagine. I'm going to come back to this, but I wanted to ask Nell to talk about what were the complaints that the flight attendants were filing?
Well, the big ones were the ways they were getting fired. If they got, they couldn't be married, they couldn't be pregnant, and they couldn't get older. Although I will say that a lot of them were secretly married and they just wouldn't tell the airline. And some airline supervisors apparently even would start reading hometown newspapers for marriage announcements to try and catch any stewardess who got married and wanted to keep flying. There was also a story, possibly apocryphal, but this was told to me by one of the women I interviewed, about a friend of hers who was a stewardess at United, I think, and she and her husband had 2 children, and she kind of had cobbled together like educational leave and maybe some other kind of leave to get pregnant and go away and have these kids. And then she came back to the airline and told everybody that her friend had died in a car crash and that she and her husband had adopted these children. So these were the lengths that these women were going to sort of live their own lives and also keep their jobs. So those are the major complaints. I mean, there were many other complaints, especially around the weight restrictions, which in fact didn't get resolved until the 1990s. Wow. And in some places are still a little iffy. But those were the major ones, like the fact that they wanted it to be a career. And for the airlines, they wanted to hire these women just as temporary workers. That was it.
And were those women representative of most of the stewardesses?
It's hard to say because they were definitely the most vocal. There were plenty of women who became stewardesses and they knew that they were just there until they got married. It was just a way to spend a few years traveling around and being independent in between graduating from high school or college and getting married. The average tenure of a stewardess at some airlines was 33 months. Like there was an incredible amount of turnover, which was totally expected. And honestly, it benefited the airlines because not only did it keep the women looking very youthful, but if you don't spend a whole lot of time fighting for better benefits and a pension and better wages when you're going to be out after a couple of years.
Which is, of course, one of the reasons that union leaders, male union leaders, didn't take them seriously.
Yeah. So a lot of my book talks about this, about the fact that stewardesses in that era were almost all unionized, and they had been since the sort of invention of the stewardess. But the unions they were in were affiliated to either a pilots union or the transport workers union, big union organizations that were run by men who looked a lot like the executives running the airlines, right? They were like middle-aged to older white men. And the union leaders, even though they negotiated for the stewardesses at the bargaining table and they brokered contracts for them, they kind of thought of the stewardesses as mascots. They weren't real workers in the way that a subway driver was a worker, or a bus driver was a worker, or even a maintenance crew of an airline, like the way that those were workers. So there was kind of a disconnect between what the stewardesses wanted, the changes they wanted. Like, they didn't want to have to wear girdles. Girdles were a required part of the uniform. And any stewardess supervisor, woman or man, or even a pilot, could conduct a girdle check on any stewardess, which essentially meant like a flick on the butt. And the stewardesses always called it a free feel. So there were like many, many issues like that, in addition to things like pay and age limits and all that they wanted the union to take up, and that they wanted to make those changes in their contract. But the union leaders couldn't have been less interested in those, in fighting for those particular issues.
But I would like to add, there was also a stewardesses union, and the woman in charge of it was named Colleen Boland. She's no longer alive, but she and I became friends. We both became co-founders of NOW. And she was a very big fighter for the rights of the stewardesses. So I'm not sure how she fit in with the other union members. Maybe you can tell us.
Absolutely. Sorry. The unions, the stewardess unions were made up. I mean, at that point, men weren't allowed to fly except on a few international airlines, or once in a while they'd occupy the purser job, which was essentially the same job as a stewardess, but better paid. So only men could have it. So the stewardess unions were made up entirely of women, and their presidents were women. The heads of those unions were women, but those unions were all affiliated to larger unions that were run by men. And those men got to make the decisions in terms of contracts and working conditions for all the women underneath them. So there's only so much speaking up you could really do, because you didn't have a seat at the table.
I was really struck by the parallels between those men in the kind of larger federation, the kind of umbrella unions, disregarding the women in the stewardess union and not viewing them as kind of long-term fighters because of the idea that they would just get married and leave, and organizing that had taken place 50 years earlier in the garment industry, where the same thing happened, where until the uprising of the 20,000 and the demonstrations after the Triangle Fire, women were simply not seen as prospects for being organized. They were seen as difficult to organize, unreliable, flighty. They're just going to get married. They won't deal with the hardships of striking. And so it was really amazing to see this literally 50 years later, practically to the year, be repeated.
Totally. And I think it's interesting that that like women who are married were not considered to be good workers. And I feel like from the airline's perspective, like I said, many of these women were secretly married. Maybe some estimates say up to 30%. And the airlines didn't know. They couldn't tell the difference in your work, whether you were married or not. But the concept that there was many things brought up, and in some of the decisions Sonia wrote at the EEOC, this idea that if a woman was married, the airlines would argue that her first interest would then be her husband and her children and her home. It would no longer be her job. So that was absolutely, like they said, a legitimate reason to not allow women to get married. or have children.
Right. And what, as you describe in your book, would you say was the real reason that airlines were insistent on women remaining unmarried?
It sounds very crude to just say sex sells, but the airlines were really doing a great job of selling sex. There's tons of airline ads in my book from the 60s and 70s, and they are truly amazing, like jaw-dropping. But you can see how they sort of become, in the 1960s, the ads are very much like the caretaker. You know, these women are young and conventionally attractive and all that, but it's all about how the ads talk about how they're on the plane to cater to these male passengers' every need. And then as the sort of feminist movement takes hold and there's like more sexual liberation in the 70s, the airlines go all in on putting the stewardesses in ever more tiny uniforms and putting them in ads and using a lot of sexual innuendo and really creating the image of the stewardess as a like flying Playboy bunny.
Right. And so the idea, it almost didn't matter in some ways to the airlines if the women were secretly married, because the whole point was the image of availability.
Yes, they had to appear single. They wanted the male business travelers, who were their big ticket items back then and probably still are, to get on a plane and imagine that every stewardess there was available.
One of the things I found so interesting about this book is that it really shows how the stewardess movement united strands of feminism that are often talked about as though they were disparate. The kind of labor side and employment fairness side, and the kind of cultural, sexual side of women being treated as sex objects in culture. And I was really interested in how, because of how the airlines pitched them as symbols of the airline and as a perk of flying for businessmen, and how that then affected their employment conditions. They really brought those two strands together.
Yeah, I think you can see very clearly in the book how feminism and labor are like inextricably intertwined, and that you know, women's rights are workers' rights, and you know, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it becomes like really, really clear when you say, as you can see, like almost the evolution of it, because a lot of the book takes place in the 70s, like in the heart of the feminist movement. Gloria Steinem was a big supporter of the stewardesses, and she was like the face of feminism. And there were these incredibly sexist ads that impacted the women as workers and encouraged sexual harassment on the plane. But also, you know, they with the feminist movement and their sort of like a consciousness raising, there was much more awareness of the fact that like these ads were wrong and that it was causing problems for them as women, as workers, and as women workers.
Exactly, that it affected them not only in how they interacted with their colleagues and superiors and customers on the day-to-day, but also in their wages and working conditions.
Yeah, 100%.
Sonia, speaking of feminism, I wonder if you would talk to us about how the inaction on the stewardesses' complaints contributed to the founding of the National Organization for Women.
Well, it is a direct line, because shortly after I came to work for the EEOC, a woman came to our offices, the Office of the General Counsel. There were 4 of us at the Office of the General Counsel: Charlie Duncan, the General Counsel, Dick Berg, the Deputy, myself, and a young man named John D'Alessio. So she came into the office one day. It would have been around early 1966, maybe the end of 65, probably towards the beginning of 66. She had written her trailblazing book 3 years earlier called Feminine Mystique, and she planned to write a second book on all the progress she thought women had made since her first book. And she had an appointment to talk to the General Counsel and the Deputy. But she saw me standing there, a woman. So she came over to me and she said, "What's really going on here? What's happening? What's doing?" So I thought to myself, if I tell her what's really happening, I'll lose my job. So I said to her, everything's fine here. So she went off to her interviews, and about 2 weeks later, she came back again. And she happened to come at a time when I had just been talking to Herman Adelsberg, who was opposed to women's rights and to doing anything about women's rights at the EEOC. And I was feeling pretty low after my discussion with Herman Adelsberg. And Betty came again and saw me and again said to me, what's going on here? What's doing? So I took her into my office and I told her, with tears streaming down my cheeks, that the commission was not enforcing the law for women, and that what this country needed was an organization to fight for women like the NAACP fought for Blacks. Well, at that time, I probably would have said colored people. And later on in 1966, early 1966, there was a meeting of the commissions of the status of women from around the country. And they wanted to pass a couple of resolutions involving the EEOC. They had heard that Dick Graham might not be reappointed, and they wanted to pass a resolution that he should be. And they wanted to also pass a resolution that the EEOC should begin to enforce the gender discrimination prohibitions of the Act. But those commissions on the status of women were meeting under the sponsorship of the Labor Department. And one federal agency cannot adopt resolutions telling another federal agency what to do. So they were told that. But they heard it as a way of putting them down rather than accepting the real reason. So they got together in Betty Friedan's room one day, and they began the founding of NOW.
And what was your role?
I was not at that meeting, but I was at a second meeting on a Halloween weekend in 1966, which was held in the basement of the Washington Post. And I became one of 49 co-founders of NOW. I am very proud to say.
And I believe that JWA has a photograph, including you, third from right, if I'm recalling correctly, yes, on our page, on our feminism resources page, which we are very, very delighted to have.
Thank you, that's true.
And I was really struck in the book that you didn't just found it, you were something of a mole.
That happened, and I can tell you the way it happened. First of all, I was not the only feminist in Washington, D.C. There were quite a number of us. We all knew each other, and we all worked together, and we all shared information. And one of those women was named Mary Eastwood, and she lived in Southwest Washington. So I was working at the EEOC, but I was increasingly frustrated by, as it has been mentioned, by the failure of the EEOC to enforce the law for women. So I don't know how this started, but I started meeting with 3 or 4 other people about once a week in Mary Eastwood's apartment. And other people who were there were Carruthers Berger, Morak Simchak, and a wonderful man named Phineas Indris. So there were just about 4 or 5 of us. And I would tell the group what I had seen at the EEOC that past week that was inimical to women. And then we would sit down and draft a letter from NOW to the EEOC saying, we understand that you did such and such, and why are you doing that? It's opposed to Title VII, or whatever we said. And we'd mail those letters off to the EEOC. What astounded me was, this went on for a while, I don't know how long, and nobody at the EEOC ever thought to say, How come now knows what we're doing at our commission meetings? I never had any consequences from doing that. I don't know that it ever served any good purpose either, but it certainly didn't result in my being fired or anything like that.
Well, it seems like it put some extremely important public pressure on the commission.
Well, I'd like to think so.
Well, did Eileen Hernandez know that you were doing that?
What?
Did Eileen Hernandez, who was also at the EEOC?
No, absolutely not. The only people who knew were the 4 or 5 of us who were meeting.
Got it. Got it. And so how did this decision in favor of the stewardesses, what brought it on? What was the process of getting to it? And what did the decision that you wrote say?
Well, let me try to take those one at a time. First of all, before Title VII became effective, which was on July 2nd, 1965, stewardesses had already been complaining to the New York Human Relations Commission. But the minute that Title VII became effective, they all came to the EEOC, and about 100 of them filed complaints of discrimination. As I mentioned, the EEOC was loath to get into this area, but with all the complaints that were filed, they had to. So they had, before dealing with the main questions, we had to deal with the question of bona fide occupational qualification, and I'll explain that.
Thank you.
Title VII had an exception only with regard to the sex discrimination prohibitions. And that exception was that although you could not, by and large, discriminate on the basis of sex, you could discriminate if sex was a bona fide occupational qualification for the job. Let me give you an extreme example of what that would be. If I was looking to hire somebody to nurse my child, I would not have to interview men for that job because sex would be a BFOQ for that job. That's about the one of the few types of such jobs I can think of. So one of the first questions posed to the EEOC was, the airlines argued that sex was a BFOQ for the stewardess job, that only women could do that job. So we had, I think, at the OC, 2 sets of hearings on this question. And of course, the airlines lost it. It was a ridiculous argument for them to make because they hired stewardesses. United States Airlines hired stewardesses for domestic flights, but they hired males doing exactly the same thing on international flights, and they called them pursers. So they couldn't very well argue that sex was a BFOQ for the job when they were hiring men for it overseas. And
that didn't stop them from trying.
No. So the first ruling of the EEOC was sex is not a BFOQ for the position of flight cabin attendant. And then there was a second set of hearings where the airlines again tried to argue. By the way, an interesting thing is that a few people know what is the actual first and most important responsibility of a flight attendant. It is not to make yourself available to the businessmen on the flight. The most important job and the first job of a flight attendant is to take care of the safety of the passengers if anything is happening with the plane.
That's right.
Few people know that. So if you know that, it gives you a slightly different picture of what a flight attendant's job was. So then the airlines were again making the argument that only women can do this job. But it was a ridiculous argument because they hired men for it and gave them a different name. So then the EEOC ruled that you can't discriminate on the basis of sex with regard to hiring flight attendants.
Well, and that ruling ultimately paved the way for the case law on sex discrimination that we have today.
Absolutely, because the way the law was written, people could then go to court. In
That's
the
right.
beginning, the EEOC did not have any authority to take cases to court. The only authority it had was to refer cases with a pattern or practice of discrimination to the Justice Department. And the Justice Department could file a complaint, or the complainant could file a complaint after the EEOC had the case for a while.
And file complaints they did. Nell, would you talk a little bit about some of these cases and how they were resolved?
I feel like the book goes into some detail about that.
Yes,
But I would say that, as Sonia said, the EEOC didn't have the ability to force the airlines to start hiring men or to stop firing women at these things. They could only recommend it very strongly. And the airlines, of course, resisted. I think Southwest Airlines didn't hire men until 1981. And so the stewardesses had to take each airline to court, like basically one at a time. And sometimes the courts decided against them. There was a lot of one step forward, two steps back, to sort of build those precedents and build that case law. But stewardesses are very persistent. I feel like we sort of described them as complainers earlier, and now they're persistent complainers. But they got the job done eventually. But it took a very long time.
And some of the cases were also filed by men who weren't getting the same kind of benefits if their wives got ill or for some reason or other. And men filed some of these court cases and were successful, and not only women.
Yeah. And as we know that, Ruth Bader Ginsburg used that strategy when she was working at the ACLU to not necessarily on the flight attendant cases, but on other sex discrimination cases to push the issue, and was quite successful in doing so. I have so many more questions, but not a lot of time left. I would love to ask, I was really interested in the religious aspect or religious identity aspect of this history. Sonia, I was interested in whether you feel that your Jewish background and identity shaped any part of your life as an activist, as a feminist, in the law that you practiced.
And the answer to that is a big yes. Not only am I Jewish, but I am a Holocaust survivor. And I was very fortunate that I was born in Berlin, Germany, Polish Jewish parents. I was very fortunate that I had a brother who was 14 years my senior. And when Hitler was named Vice Chancellor of Germany on May 30th, 1933, my brother saw shortly thereafter the threat to the Jews, and he was responsible for my family fleeing from Germany, and eventually coming to the United States. So you can imagine what kind of a background, what kind of an effect a background like that would have for someone working at the EEOC. But something else came into play in my life related to that. By the time that I was 6, my life had been saved about 4 times. That had a tremendous effect on me. And it left me with a feeling that I understand now, but I didn't as a child. It left me with the feeling that my life had been saved for a reason. And there was something that I was supposed to do in the world. And I knew that I couldn't just get married and raise a family, which is what was expected of young women in those days. I knew there was something I was supposed to do, and that was the reason my life was saved. So I looked for that something all my life, and I found it when I was 37 years old, and I joined the EEOC.
That is profoundly moving. I know that I speak for many of us here when I say thank you for all that you have done to make it possible for many of us to be where we are. And I would like to invite anyone who has any last questions to put them in the chat. I see many people thanking you, Sonia, for being here, and Nell for your book. And I would just like to say I highly recommend Nell's book, The Great Stewardess Rebellion. It was a wonderful, fast-paced, entertaining, as well as very well-researched read, and I enjoyed it tremendously. So thank you both for being here with us tonight. I would also like to invite everyone to be here next week when we will be speaking with Cindy Kaplan, the author of Free Fall, One Mother's Journey Raising a Child with Special Needs, on understanding how expectations shape parents' relationships with children and with themselves. Thank you all again for being here. Thank you to Nell and Sonia, and I hope that you all have a wonderful night.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Good night.
Good night.